Is economics a discipline in intellectual decline?
I don't think so. First of all, I'm not sure it's a proper test of a science to be able to predict imminent events. Geologists and seismologists know more about earthquakes than anybody else does, but they can't predict when the next one is going to come. Meteorologists understand hurricanes better than anybody else does, but they don't know exactly when or where the next hurricane is going to come. I find the use of the word decline odd. If you look at the quality of economic forecasts as measured by, to use the fancy statistical term, root mean square error, basically how big's your average mistake, that's trended downwards through time. So by that standard, economists have a better understanding than they used to. Yeah, I did get it right on inflation, and I think it's a bit of a puzzle why others didn't. I think it probably has more to do with the political incentives of people making forecasts than it does some fundamental intellectual failure of the discipline. Forecasts are probabilistic. I don't know of anybody who said they thought there was an 80% chance of a recession. So if you say you think it's more likely than not that there's going to be a recession and then there isn't, I don't think that you've made a hugely consequential error. So if I wanted to judge whether the discipline of economics was in decline, I'd look at the fact that when I started out, economists were mostly people who tried to guess whether there was going to be a recession or not. And now the EPA is filled with economists doing cost-benefit analyses of regulation. The Justice Department is filled with economists doing analyses of what will promote competition in the context of antitrust policy. The Treasury and the Fed used to all be people who were ex-bankers. Now they're large numbers of people with the discipline of economics. If you look at what's happened in the cutting edge of the other social science disciplines, political science, sociology, basically a lot of it is importing techniques and approaches from economics. If you look at who gets appointed central bank heads around the world, it's in much larger number economists than it ever used to be. So God knows economists don't understand everything about the economy, but I'd sure take the judgments of economists over the judgments of any other group of people who make comments, or certainly take it over their critics. And, you know, it's all the statistics we use to measure all these things were invented and developed and refined by economists. So I would say if you took among the social sciences, I don't see how you could escape the conclusion that economics has been by far the most successful over the last half century.
But I remember you making a comment, I think at a Hoover Institution conference a couple of years ago, about the Fed model. And I want to get you to talk about that, because at the heart of modern economics is the idea that one can model human behavior, one can model the behavior of the economy. And the most influential model in the world is the model that the Federal Reserve uses. And your observation, I'm probably going to misquote you here, was that when you fed into the model very extreme values, I think, on fiscal policy, its results were bizarrely clustered together in ways that seemed intuitively wrong. So talk a bit about that, because it seems to me that if there's a problem with the Fed model, one of the things that revealed that was what they got wrong in 2021 that you got right. If there's a problem with the Fed model, isn't there a deep problem with economics itself?
I don't think so at multiple levels, though. If you're going to remember what I say on previous occasions and throw it back in my face, we're going to stop having sessions like this. That kind of thing's
Just what you do to me on these occasions.
That kind of thing's really not quite fair, Neil. Look, I think there are a few points to make. First of all, we all have models. How do you think about things except with a model? Why is it that when somebody sticks their hand out, I understand that I'm supposed to stick my hand out to shake hands? It's because my model of human behavior is that when somebody shakes their hands, that's what you do. You shake hands. So all thought essentially takes the form of models. All judgments about, is UATX going to be a success over the next 5 years? Is the economy going to grow fast next year? Reflect a kind of mental model of how the world operates. So the question isn't, should we have models or not have models? In the absence of models, you can't think. So the question, and it's not that non-economists have some alternative model. So the question can be, what are the virtues of explicit, more mathematical models versus implicit, more subjective models? And certainly quantitative models sometimes go wrong, but they have the feature that when they've gone wrong, you can see that they've gone wrong and you can change them, and you can fix them. So I think the impulse to use mathematics, to use statistics, to use data more rather than less has to be a proper impulse. Do I think some people are overly mechanical about believing some statistical thing they estimated on a computer and not applying judgment? Absolutely. Is that something I've tried to avoid when I was a policymaker? Absolutely. Is there a particular tool that is used more by the Fed staff than by the Fed policymakers that isn't the tool that I would use if I was the Fed staff? Yeah, they use a model that I don't think is a very good model. One of the problems in any organization with having people do the same job for 15 or 20 years is that they tend to get a little attached to the way they've done things before and not update things in respect to the ways the world has changed. Is there that kind of tendency at the Fed? Absolutely. There is that kind of tendency at the Fed. So yeah, I think I was right to criticize the Fed's model, but I don't think of that as some kind of deep critique of the field of economics relative to some alternative paradigm that exists. It seems to me most of the interesting and significant criticisms and improvements that have come to economics have come more from within economics than from the outside. The Marxists have been yelling for decades, I think, to produce no improvement in prediction or explanatory power. The so-called modern monetary theorists represent a challenge to the orthodoxy that I don't think has gotten anywhere. So, yeah, are there a ton of economists who are much too complacent about the current models? Yeah, I certainly do think that that's true, but thinking of it, I think there's no evidence for the proposition that it's a profession or a discipline in decline, and you have to judge things relative to some kind of comparative standard.
So we're on the eve of one of the biggest policy-induced shocks that there have been, I suspect, in our lifetimes, in that the president intends tomorrow to increase tariffs on a substantial number of US trade partners, some on the reciprocal basis and more perhaps to come on the sectoral basis. I've seen estimates that make it a return to the average US tariff rate of 1937 if he goes through with all of the things that he's talked about. This seems like a really easy problem for economists, which I guess is why so many Nobel laureates in economics urged people to vote against Trump last year. Is this just straightforwardly bad because free trade is straightforwardly good?
I think the simplest way to think about this is as a self-imposed supply shock. We're going to take all the things we buy and we're going to make them more expensive. And when we do that, the price level is going to be higher. That's bad. People are going to have to pay those higher prices, so the same income is going to go less far, so they're going to be poorer, and they're going to be able to buy less, and that's going to mean there's less demand, and that's going to make unemployment go up. So doing something that increases both inflation and unemployment kind of seems like it's not a very good idea. And so I think this is not a very good idea. It's really a quite terrible idea. But even if one believed in a protectionist philosophy, there is a protectionist philosophy which says, look, somehow we can't find enough work for everybody to do in our country. And so if we get more work done in our country, then we will put more people to work and that'll be better for the economy. And so it's a good idea to restrict imports. That has a certain logic to it. I think it's basically more wrong than right because the premise is wrong. We can find enough work for everybody to do. The unemployment rate is 4%. But let's suppose that it was right. Then what would you want to put tariffs on? You'd want to put tariffs on things that were directly purchased by consumers so that the people who were producing them would produce them in the United States, not abroad. That's at least an understandable proposition. So why is a centerpiece of the Trump policy tariffing steel and aluminum when there are 60 times as many people who work in industries that use steel and aluminum as there are in the steel and aluminum industries? Why are we making automobile parts a central part of what we're putting tariffs on when the process of producing a vehicle involves it moving back and forth across the Canadian border or the Mexican border half a dozen times? So even if the goal were to make our producers more competitive somehow, I don't think that's the right way to think about economics. I think the right way to think about economics is in terms of promoting exchange and division of labor and gains from trade. But even if one thought the whole idea was about making yourself more competitive, these policies are terribly designed with respect to that objective. And that's even before you get to the question of them retaliating. These are bad policies before anybody has retaliated against us. I mean, a football team that can't run a play in practice when there's no defense is a pretty futile football team. And we have noticed that I've said that these are going to hurt our economy before I've considered the fact that other countries are not going to take this lying down and are going to respond in a whole set of ways. So the answer to the question, Neil, is this is much worse than a bad idea just because of the standard arguments for free trade, because these policies seem almost well designed to invite retaliation and almost well designed to hurt American exporters. And that's a big deal. Here's a number that when I first heard it, even though I'd been studying this stuff for a long time, surprised me. 45% of American imports are inputs to American exports. And so it's really a big deal, this stuff about competitiveness. So I don't get where this is coming from. There's no constituency in the business community for doing this in this way. There's an additional problem in the way it's being done, which is that you're inducing enormous amounts of uncertainty. And when there's uncertainty, people delay, hoping that the uncertainty will be resolved. So, tariffs up for 3 days, tariffs down for 6 days. I mean, in addition to what the effect of it is, everybody thinks, God, why should I buy a washing machine till this is all clear? Or why should I buy a car till this is all clear? Or why should I commit to building a certain kind of factory until this is all kind of clearer? So, I was just looking at some data. There have been 20 presidential terms since 1948. This is the second worst in terms of the performance of the stock market in the 2 months to the end of March since Inauguration Day. That can't be very surprising. If you asked all the consensus forecasters at the beginning of January what the odds were on a recession this year, they would have said 10 to 15%. You ask people today, they'd kind of say 40 to 50%. That's like doing a lot of damage for your central economic policy. And, I've been doing this stuff for 40 years. I've never heard a president say, well, we might have a recession, it'll be okay. I've heard presidents say we won't have a recession when they're probably wrong, and they're trying to add confidence to the situation. But saying we might have a recession, it'll be okay, I've never heard that particular play before. So I find all this quite bizarre, and I don't really understand what the constituency for it is. There are many more automobile workers being screwed by the steel tariffs than there are steel workers being helped by the steel tariffs.
So let me ask you a slightly different question. It's clear, if one goes all the way back to 2001, that after it was admitted to the World Trade Organization, China cheated in multiple ways. China continues to subsidize its industries in all kinds of ways. It engages in unfair competition. It does things that look, to me at least, like dumping. And it's done this for a quarter of a century nearly. What do you do to stop that, to check that kind of behavior of gaming a free trade system if it's not tariffs? Or is there nothing you can do? You just have to live with it?
Can I ask a question? Could every student here who's paying $10,000 or more in tuition raise their hand?
Yeah, we don't have tuition.
I'm aware of that. I'm aware of
Yet.
that. That was the point that I was making. So you have no tuition. Why do you have no tuition? You have no tuition because somehow you have succeeded in mobilizing funds that have enabled you to admit students without paying. And so students get the benefit of an education without paying. Do you think that if the University of Texas or Harvard or Rice called this an unfair practice because it put them at a competitive disadvantage, that would be a reasonable thing? Or do you think that it's a good thing that you're able to provide free college educations, and it would be even better if more people could provide free college educations? I kind of have the latter view. So if China wants to sell us things at really low prices, and the transaction is we get solar collectors that help make there be less global climate change, or we get batteries that we can put in electric cars, and we send them pieces of paper that we print. Think that's a good deal for us or a bad deal for us? I kind of think it's a good deal for us. So the idea, the way you frame the question, which is that this is cheating and is there a way to deal with the problem of cheating, I think is largely wrong. It's just like, was it unfair to dentists when fluoride water got invented? It was terrible for the dental business. Terrible. Far fewer cavities. Far less for dentists to do. Was it terrible when electric light got invented? Terrible for the candle makers. So there's this thing that lets people buy things for lower cost. Should you say that's terrible? I think the whole way of framing the question is wrong. Now, I'm making it simpler than it is. There is an issue. It's called, which economists call predatory pricing, which is the idea that somebody will sell things at a really low price, then they'll drive all their competitors out of business, and then they'll jack the price way up. And so if you thought that all of this was sort of setting us up for the kill in terms of total dependence on China, that would be an argument that might lead you to want to have a policy. It's pretty hard to make that case with respect to the vast number of things we're importing. China's only one source of them. If the price did get jacked up, our producers could re-enter the market. In the entire history of economics, there have been almost no examples documented of where predatory pricing actually happened. There's an argument you can make that is about dependence, perhaps with respect to really sensitive technologies. We don't want to depend on China because then they might cut us off and their government might take control, and that might be bad for our national security. And there are a lot of things to do about that. We should stockpile more things than we do. There are probably some areas like semiconductors where we should be investing in developing domestic capacity. But that's not an argument that because they're making something available cheap, it's cheating and you should have a policy. So I'd reject the entire way in which you framed the question.
I actually like the idea that the University of Austin is perhaps engaged in predatory pricing, aiming at driving Harvard out of business, and we should definitely adopt that as part of our business plan. Let me switch then from trade policy to fiscal policy, because one thing seems pretty clear, even to a simple economic historian. The United States cannot run a fiscal deficit north of 6% of GDP indefinitely. And that leads at some point to real trouble. The way I've tried to formulate it is that if you're spending more on interest payments than on defense as a great power, then you almost certainly have a problem coming. The Trump administration says it's doing something about this. I mean, you could argue, indeed some people in the administration do argue, that the tariffs will be a source of revenue and that there will therefore be some fiscal benefit. There's a Department of Government Efficiency, which is also supposed to be addressing waste in the federal government. If you were back in the position of Treasury Secretary, which I grant you is unlikely under Donald Trump, but if you were back in that position and the president said to you, we urgently need to address the fiscal problem, what would your recommendations be? How would you go about stabilizing American public finance?
First, I equip the president with some facts. I tell him that even if we fired every federal employee, it would reduce the deficit perhaps from 6 to about 5.4. That the vast majority of what the government does is write checks, not employ people. So the notion that you can get a bunch of efficiency experts and run around like you were a corporation taking costs out is just not. There is some waste to find, and it's a good idea to try to find it, but it's not a large-scale policy for reducing the deficit. And I would tell the president that he is president at a time where there is a big challenge for the country. And the big challenge for the country is that it used to be that we had 4 or 5 working age people for every person over 65. And now we have 2.5 people for every person over 65. And so if you want to provide the same benefits that we did before, you need to have, relative to the payroll that working people are earning, you've got to have a much higher tax rate than you did before. And that's the basic logic of what happens when half your federal budget is spending on the aged and another sixth of your federal budget is spending on interest. And so you have a choice, Mr. President. You can either tell people that the social contract we've had in terms of how much the aged are getting relative to the working people is going to get cut way back, or you can have higher taxes than we used to. And you have to decide to have one of those two things. But if you say we can balance the budget without having one of those two things, you're not speaking the truth. My personal view would be when the maximum Social Security benefit in the country that a person can get if they've worked for their whole life and earned about $125,000, their maximum possible Social Security benefit that they can get is $45,000. I don't tend to find it all that attractive for people like me and you who've been fortunate to talk about how we need to find the courage to bite the bullet, to cut the benefits of a bunch of people who are at most going to get $45,000. My values. Somebody else might have different values. So I think a significant part of the adjustment has to take place on the tax side. Here's a fact. The projections are that over the next 10 years, there will be $8 trillion, that's trillion with a TR, dollars in taxes that are owed but not paid. In 2018, which is one of the most recent years for which we have the data, there were 100 people who had incomes over $10 million, who didn't file any tax return at all, and the statute of limitations for 3 years ran without anybody at the IRS noticing and trying to audit them. And that's related to the fact that the IRS budget has been cut relative to the scale of taxes by about half since 2010. The Biden administration was trying to fix all of that. The Trump administration has taken away what the Biden administration did and then done a bunch of other cutting besides. And that's why there are people at the IRS, and we don't yet know whether they're right, who think that who think that tax collections are running way behind schedule because people are deciding that nobody's going to do anything to them if they don't pay taxes. The first thing we should do is we should enforce the tax law, and we could raise hundreds of billions of dollars a year just by enforcing the law we have.
Do you think you need additional taxes? I mean, it's interesting that the Trump administration has gone after value-added tax, arguing to me somewhat implausibly that it's some kind of non-tariff barrier. But isn't the real argument that the US needs a value-added tax, and it's odd that it doesn't yet have one? Would you advocate an additional tax like that?
Maybe. I think, look, I've said something 35 years ago, and it was true then, and it's, I think, still true today, which is that liberals oppose a value-added tax, which is basically a kind of national sales tax, because they think it's regressive. And conservatives oppose it because they think it's invisible and therefore a money machine that will enable a larger government. And we'll get it only when liberals decide it's a money machine for government and conservatives decide it's regressive. And I made that quip up in the mid-'80s, and it still works today, and I don't think it's going to happen anytime hugely soon. But I think the serious issue for the country that we haven't really reckoned with is that even if everybody does everything right, because more of the population is aged, because what government does is provide services, and the price of services goes up relative to the price of physical goods, because we've got a bunch more debt than we used to. Even if we don't do anything new to avoid a big deficit, we have to find a way to raise more revenue.
I'm going to ask one more econ question, then a little higher ed, and then we're going to open it up to the audience. You are on the board of OpenAI. Tell us what AI is going to do for the economy, and does it help solve these intractable fiscal problems that we've just been discussing?
It's hard to make predictions, especially about the future. And Proposition 1. Proposition 2, in general, almost always, things take longer to happen than you think they will, and then they happen faster than you thought they could. And so, will AI change the economy 9 months from now? I doubt it. Will it have hugely profound effects 9 years from now? I think the answer is yes. I hesitate to do this in the presence of one of the world's most distinguished economic historians, but here's an economic history of humanity in 90 seconds. From the beginning of time until roughly the time of Pericles, there was no growth. Sometimes there was a lot of food and people ate better. Sometimes there was less food and people ate worse. But basically there was no progress. From the time of Pericles till kind of after the Renaissance, maybe 1500, there was growth at about 2 or 3 basis points a year. That means it was 2 or 3% a century. Then, nobody can measure these things exactly, but around 1500, there was a seismic change. The growth rate went from 2 basis points a year, 2% a century, to 20 basis points a year, 20% a century. So it was very clear that in England in 1800, things were better than they had been in 1500. But the growth wasn't fast enough that anybody could see between the beginning of their life and their end of their life that standards of living had systematically improved. And then there was this extraordinary epic event, the Industrial Revolution. And for the first time in human history, you could expect that living standards would be better at the end of your life than they were at the beginning of your life. And growth rose, depends on exactly the period and exactly the place, to 1.5% or 2% a year. So we've had several discontinuities: 0 to growth, tiny growth to 10 times as much, 10 times as much to 10 times as much as all of that. I think it's possible that artificial intelligence will lead to another discontinuity in the growth process that will lead to very substantial acceleration in the rate of growth. Part of that is because of what everybody focuses on, which is that, gosh, an AI can do this, and an AI can do that, and it can do this job, and it can do that job, and it can do the other job, so isn't that going to make things much more productive? That's aspect one. Aspect two is it might mean we have 50 years of scientific progress in 7. And ultimately, it's scientific progress that drives growth. And aspect three is it permits a degree of coordination that and replication and scaling that isn't possible with people. And so potentially, this is going to change everything about how the economy operates, and is going to be an industrial revolution scale event. Am I sure that that's going to happen? No. But the changes are really quite extraordinary. And I would say the thing that has surprised me most is that in the year and a half that I've been involved with AI, that rule I said about things take longer to happen than you think they will hasn't happened. Most of the things that a year ago I was told would take 3 years to happen have already happened in terms of progress with these models. So this is going to be an immense thing. When your intellectual great-grandchild writes the history of this period in 21, 25, my guess is that stuff about Donald Trump will be the second or third story, and stuff about Xi will be the second or third story. And the first story will be that we had this transformative change in the ways in which ways in which people lived and the ways in which the things they enjoyed were produced.
Well, what we're going to do now is open this up to questions. There's a microphone there, and if you want to ask a question, form an orderly line, or I guess it's UATX, you could start auctioning places in the line, but it's probably more efficient just to have a line. And maybe just introduce yourself before you ask the question.
Hi, I'm Alistair. And any Fed hot takes, Larry? Or is fiscal policy more important than monetary policy?
Fed hot takes. We should point out that you could have been Fed chair in a parallel universe. You became Fed chair. So this is a question you're quite well qualified to address.
Look, I think the Fed is as uncertain as every place else is. You would have said a little while ago that the issues were mostly about reducing interest rates. Now that we're getting all this inflation pressure from the tariffs, I don't think it's 100% clear which way interest rates will move. My view is that the neutral interest rate is much higher than the market consensus thinks. And so I don't think interest rates will come down substantially unless we have a recession, but I think there's a reasonably good chance that we'll have a recession.
Reasonably good is still what, 50%?
In the neighborhood of 50%.
And then is
one question per student, otherwise we'll never get anywhere through this line. Thank you.
Mr. Summers, you're old, I'm young. You mentioned before, you said before that you didn't think that you were in a position.
I like to think of myself as middle-aged with a extended middle.
You're middle-aged, I'm young. You said before that you didn't think you should be telling other middle-aged people that their Social Security should be cut. But the effect of that is to place the burden on people like us tonight who are young and who are going to have to spend the next 40 or 50 years paying for people who are, in the scheme of things compared to us, already quite well off. Boomers are on average one of the wealthiest generations in U.S. history. And at a time when there are fewer of us, as you mentioned before, and so we're going to be per capita paying far more. How do you think that's fair?
I feel your pain. Not really. I actually have a quite different view about this. It could change, but if I think about the morality of myself versus my grandparents or my great-grandparents, gosh, I wish there was a way to go back in time and give them more and have less. I lived so much better than they had the opportunity to, that the last thing that I would worry about is that somehow I was overburdened by taking care of them. I wish I had done more. I wish there had been a way that more could be transferred back to them. If I'm even close to right, if 6% of what I said about AI is right, your generation is going to have opportunities to work with far more ease, to enjoy opportunities and forms of entertainment and forms of spending that go beyond anything that my generation enjoyed. That the notion that the tax rate would be a little bit higher for the most fortunate members of your generation than it was of my generation. I mean, take like a canonical member of the generation that I would imagine is between us, Mark Zuckerberg. He's got $200 billion. If his tax rate went up a little bit and $200 billion pays, who knows exactly what it pays, but let's say it pays 6%, that's $12 billion a year. I promise you he's not paying $1 billion a year in taxes. He paid more taxes, be okay with me. So, yeah, I think we should think about generational fairness, but the overwhelming thing to keep in mind about generational fairness is progress. And that's the overwhelming thing to keep in mind when you think about generational fairness.
So as you're writing your checks to the IRS, just think of all the benefits AI is going to bring your generation. That's our message. Thanks very much. We'll take the next question, please.
Hello, my name is Rhett. Thank you so much. This is so fascinating. So, China has raised the quality of life immensely for 1 billion people in just 50 years, and they don't really seem to pose a threat to us that much at all, and don't seem to in the future. Why should we be so set on beating China in this, I don't know, trade war or geopolitical,
or indeed AI competition?
Yeah, or AI, exactly, yeah.
Well, so as far as the trade war is concerned, I won't repeat the whole explanation I gave about how if they wanted to give us stuff, we should take it and not tariff them and all that. So as far as that's concerned, I was kind of taking the position that you're taking. I think you have to make a judgment about their possible paths forward. And if you were confident that they were going to pursue their greatness in their way, and we were going to pursue our greatness in our way, and we were going to benefit from exchange, there'd be no reason to hold them down or have any kind of struggle. But if you thought that their concept of defining their greatness was going to involve substantial encroachments that could ultimately bear on our security in the way that people came to think of the Soviet Union after the Second World War, or that you thought that their defining their greatness was going to involve attacks that would fall on countries that we had committed ourselves to defend, and that if we gave up that commitment, they would then defend themselves by getting their own nuclear weapons in ways that would make the world much more dangerous. That's something that you have to think very hard about how you're going to protect against. And so the strategic dilemma with respect to China, and it's a very hard thing to manage, is how do you hedge against the possibility that they are going to aggressively seek hegemony in ways that deeply threaten us, without your effort to hedge seeming a provocation to them to build up more strength because they fear you. And that's the task of statesmanship. And Neil has chronicled occasions when it has been done well and occasions when it has been done poorly through the years. But I think it is fair to say that if one looks over the last decade, that it is harder to make the case that China is entirely benign than it would have been a decade ago. If you simply look at the speeches of Chinese leaders, both what they say publicly and what it is reported that they have said privately, if you look at the extent of Chinese military spending and buildup of weapons that are really only with offensive use, if you look at their interactions with neighboring countries, if you look at efforts in various ways to sabotage and subvert things that are going on in our economy, it is harder to see them as entirely benign and to think that it's responsible to not hedge than was the case a decade ago. That doesn't mean that the most extreme cold warriors with respect to China are right, but it's why I think it's a little bit more complex than the way your initial formulation would suggest.
Now, is that an example of a question that you need history to answer, that economics can't answer? Feels like we should at least contemplate the possibility that there are a class of questions that really do require history to be answerable.
I think we should do more than contemplate it. I don't know what we can learn from in human affairs other than history. So I very much share your sort of trying to provoke me into doing an advertisement for you, and you've succeeded.
Me?
I think
provoke?
I think Neil has been a progenitor of a whole movement towards what he calls applied history, which is basically the idea that we should, as it has been processed by me, is basically the idea we should study history, not just because we're kind of curious about what was going on during the Victorian period, but because human nature is kind of a constant. And so studying how it plays out in all kinds of different contexts can help us think about the problems that we have today. And I think absolutely in considering the implications of China's rise, there are all kinds of historical episodes that are relevant. People often talk about the relationship between Germany and the UK before the First World War. I think there are things to be learned there. I have been influenced in your direction as I've thought about these things by what I've learned about what provoked the Pearl Harbor attack. And that is, I think, cautionary with respect to some concepts that American policymakers have. So absolutely, history is really the only tool that we have for helping us think systematically about problems as they arise.
Thanks, Larry.
Hi, my name is Ben. My question is, do you think it was wise to move on from the gold standard to a central bank, or was that a blunder?
Yeah, it surely was wise. There are lots of arguments you can make about exactly how you should determine how much money you want to have to be in circulation. But having it depend on the accident of how much gold miners find and decide to get out of the ground seems an approach that's extremely unlikely to generate monetary arrangements that are conducive to a well-functioning economy. So what exact regime one should have is debatable, but the idea that you should be hostage to gold mining seems like a very poor way to organize a global economy. And so I think there's very little support among people who think about these things for the idea that there should be some kind of return to the gold standard.
Thanks, Larry. Next up, please.
Given that Russia in its war against Ukraine has done, I think, better than anyone would have expected in face of the sanctions Western countries have imposed on it, what do you think that reveals about Western economic statecraft? Do you think that the economic warfare that the Trump administration is considering just is ineffective or has fundamental limitations in a multipolar world?
I think you've raised a very, very important question that I wish I had studied more and had more insight into. What it brings to mind when I think about, there basically are two broad ways of understanding this fact, and I don't know which of them is right and in what proportion. John Kenneth Galbraith, the great economic polemicist, the first significant thing he did in his career was he was in charge of the review of Allied strategic bombing of Germany during World War II. And the Allies dropped a ton of bombs on Germany, and they were doing what they thought was strategic bombing. There were all kinds of good ideas, like there are only 2 factories that make ball bearings, and if we knock out the 2 factories, then they won't have any ball bearings, and then all their stuff won't work. And so it was assumed that strategic bombing could really do enormous damage to an economy. And what appears to have been the case is that our strategic bombing did remarkably little damage to the functioning of the German economy. And I think that part of the right interpretation of that fact is that economists are more like frogs than they are like people. If you cut off a frog's tail, it regrows the tail. It's able to reconnect all the systems. And that economies probably have more capacity to work around blockages than we imagine. That's one aspect of it. The other aspect of it is whether we were really sanctioning them or whether there was all kinds of corruption and leakage that caused the sanctions not really to happen. And we had a big problem, which was, we had two big problems. One is that their big revenue source was the thing that we most wanted, that being oil, because gasoline prices are hugely salient politically in the United States and around the world. So how good a job were we really going to do of cutting off their exports? Answer, not very. And that we had a whole continent with a relatively stagnant economy that really liked selling things to Russia. And so how good a job were we going to do of stopping selling things to Russia? So if you don't stop them from selling and you don't stop them from buying, then you don't sanction them that effectively. And how much of their economic success, you know, President Biden famously said we were going to reduce the ruble to rubble. We didn't. And why the sanctions were so ineffective, I think, is a hugely important question for study, and it reinforces my skepticism about economic sanctions as a huge tool of diplomacy. But every time I get too skeptical about economic sanctions as a tool of diplomacy, I remind myself that usually there are three things you can do when a country has done terrible things. You got basically three options. Do nothing, do economic sanctions, or have like a shooting war. And given that those are the three choices that exist, it's not that surprising that pretty often people go back to economic sanctions, even if they're not the world's greatest policy, because they're better than the alternatives.
That reminds me of the Kissinger point, and this shows that you've been in government, that recommendations to the president should always be three. And in the case of a foreign policy problem, the choices are: one, surrender; two, what the bureaucracy recommends; three, World War III. And this is the way that you should always present any decision to the president. That's kind of a good illustration of the point. By the way, your disclaimer that you hadn't looked into this too deeply was a little insincere, given that you've been one of the co-authors of a very important piece of work on how we should deal with the Russian reserve assets that were frozen when the war broke out. And I think I should pay tribute to you, because you, Phil Zelek or Bob Zelek, have been consistently arguing that there should be much tougher action on those frozen reserves than has so far been envisioned. Do you think that might change under the new dispensation? The Europeans were the people who resisted confiscation or some other tougher measures. I have a sense that their attitude has changed quite significantly since January the 20th. Do you think there's going to be more action on that front?
I am guardedly optimistic that there may be more actions, because Europe's going to have to come up with a lot more money. And while they didn't much like seizing the Russian assets, as between seizing the Russian assets and taxing their own citizens, seizing the Russian assets is likely to look a bit better.
Thanks for that. We'll have the next question, please. That line just keeps getting longer. We'll try and go at a fair clip. I'm conscious that we're approaching 7 o'clock, but we started rather later than advertised. So I think we've probably got, have we got 10 more minutes in us to try and get through the line? Great questions. Next up.
Hi, I'm Christian. Thank you very much for your time, for the engaging talk, and for your support of this fledgling institution. My question is in regards to crowding out from high and persistent debt levels. What do you foresee as going forward? Is like a linear or like an exponential increase in the debt level going to have a commensurate crowding out effect? Do you think it's not very significant of an effect?
It's going to be harder for you guys to buy houses because of higher interest rates, because of all the debt that we have. It's going to be harder for businesses to make new investments because of the debt that we have. I have kind of thought that long-term interest rates were likely to rise substantially. I've been wrong for the last 3 months. I think that is because it's looking more likely that we're going to have a recession, and that's a bigger deal than what's happening with the deficit. But I have been wrong, so gives me a little bit more humility in making forecasts. But my instincts are towards substantial and costly crowding out, and there being a real risk of a vicious cycle where higher interest rates mean bigger deficits, and bigger deficits mean higher interest rates, and the thing can become a bit explosive and highly problematic. It's been said that in democracy, fear does the work of reason, and my guess is sooner or later we'll do something about the deficit, but it will take spiking interest rates before we do.
Thank you.
We'll take as many more questions as we can. We're going to go to lightning round mode, so keep the questions punchy, and Larry, you'll keep your answers punchy too, please.
Howdy. Given the experimental university that you speak of, what are the bounds with which that university ought to experiment? UATX just announced their new admissions policy, which is test or scores only, and some achievements. That's certainly an experiment, and we'll see how that turns out. But there are many aspects of UATX that still look like a traditional university. There's still a teacher in front of the class, no electronics, no AI. Are those things that ought to be experimented with as well, given the advancements in technology?
Look, UATX is not the only experiment in the world. And so not all experiments that are good ideas have to be done at UATX. And I don't know what's exactly right for UATX, but my instincts would be that experimental institutions should be paying a lot of attention to AI and the use of AI in pedagogy and models that move away from teacher in front of room, students in back of room. I think there should be a lot of experimentation with that. Whether this is the right venue and what form those experiments should take, I don't know. I mean, the great thing about experiments is that if they succeed, then they can be multiplied 100-fold. If they fail, then we've learned that something we might have tried doesn't work and we don't have to try it again. And so in general, the world engages in much too little experimentation, because the person who does the experiment doesn't get all the benefit from all the people who copy it, and doesn't get all the benefits from the people who don't have to try it again after it fails. So there's just too little experimentation in the world in general, and that's why the kind of experimentation that you represent is so positive.
Thank you.
Next up, Konstantin.
Thank you. My name is Konstantin, and my question goes to both of you, given that we live in a time where people that are championing interdependence are viciously attacked and quite harshly accused of things. You just hinted at this, Professor Summers, but in 1910, Norman Angell, I think it was, wrote The Great Illusion, in which he describes how impossible it is for Great Britain and Germany to go to war, given their economic interdependence. And I wanted to ask you, in regards to the current tariffs and other protectionist measures that are being implemented, what implications this could have for the potential conflict in Taiwan, especially, given that seems like that's the only thing holding up catastrophe or a hellscape.
Well, you were talking, Larry, about the analogy with Pearl Harbor, and I was quite tempted to ask you to talk more about that. This is a great opportunity to do it. Hypothesis: the Trump administration is applying ever greater pressure on the Chinese economy. Tariffs already are at above 30% on Chinese exports. They're going to go higher. The Chinese make it sound like they can handle that, but their economy is heavily reliant on exports. And so I'm not sure I believe them. And there is an alternative retaliation option open to them, not to retaliate through the trade channel, but to retaliate through the national security channel. Taiwan was the object of yet more exercises in the last 24 hours, with the largest force yet of vessels around the island. Do you worry that we are stumbling through an aggressive trade policy towards a war with China?
My instincts would be towards significantly less economic suppression of China, except with respect to national security technologies, and significantly more strengthening of our military capacities with respect to the Pacific region than appears to be the policy that we are pursuing. The idea that has been brooded several times, though not implemented, by the Trump administration, that in the face of what's happening right now, we should substantially cut our defense budget, seems to me to be a Neville Chamberlain level error.
That's a very big error. Thanks, Larry. I think we've got time for one more question, and then we should probably call it a night with. Sorry to disappoint.
We can do two more. We can do two.
We'll do two more. All right, two more, please.
Thank you so much for being here, Mr. Summers. I remember reading your Wikipedia page, and so years ago. So I'm on a mission to impact 1 billion people positively in the next 10 years, and right now looking at technology as the asymmetric lever to pull. Seems like quantum computing is going to be the next great revolution that can unlock change. And I wanted to ask you, but what black swans, obviously they can't be predicted, but what black swans do you see, and what asymmetric areas do you recommend that we go into? Right now, quantum sensing seems to be something that can significantly improve U.S. defense against China, and I'd love to hear your advice on all of us who are looking to impact the world. What should we do?
I don't have nuanced, intelligent opinions on different aspects of quantum computing. I suspect that with all the excitement about AI at this instant, the various revolutions in the life sciences and their capacity for human augmentation and all the ethical implications that follow from that are probably receiving less attention than they should. And so I think that would be an area that I would be paying, that I would advise paying close attention to. I'd also just encourage you to think about social science and social innovation. You know, I learned when I was president of Harvard that the Harvard School of Public Health and some kind of social science person of some kind had germinated the whole designated driver idea. And my guess is that the designated driver idea saved as many lives as a huge amount of biological research. Like Neil, I'm pretty against the excessively woke. And so there's all kinds of things that happened at the Harvard Education School that I was skeptical of. But the Harvard Education School did incubate Sesame Street. And I think you could make a case that the good that Sesame Street did was enough to justify 50 years of the Harvard Education School. Even if you didn't like some of the other things that happened in the Harvard Education School. So I'd encourage you, as you think about innovation, not to confine it to hard science, but to think about social innovation on the Sesame Street designated driver model as a type of area to work in.
Not many people can get you from quantum to Sesame Street in one answer. We're going to give Larry one more question. Thank you very much. One more question before we call it a day or a night, please.
Okay. You're very reluctant to make predictions, which is quite prudent. I ask, what is the purpose of social sciences if not to make predictions?
It is to understand how social processes operate, both because that's intellectually satisfying and because with a better understanding of how social processes operate, one has a better prospect of contributing to their design and contributing to the choices that people operating in social settings make, so that there will be better outcomes. And so I can't predict with any great accuracy where and when the next automobile accidents will come, but by studying automobile accidents, one can contribute to the development of better brakes and better tires, and therefore make cars safer. And so judging the ability to make something better by the ability to make predictions is, I think, not the right criteria. And indeed, in some cases, science predicts unpredictability. If you've taken, I don't know how many people here have taken a finance course, but one of the 2 or 3 most important ideas you'd be exposed to if you took a finance course is what could be called the efficient markets or the martingale theory, which in essence is the following idea. Think about IBM stock. If there was a good reason to think that it would go up, people would buy it, and then it would have already gone up. If there was a good reason to think it would go down, people would sell it. And so almost the fundamental logic of the situation is that the price goes to a level where there's equipoise between opinion, dollar weighted, that it's going to go up and that it's going to go down. And it follows that the movements will be completely unpredictable. And so you can explain why things become unpredictable by applying various kinds of social scientific reasoning, but that doesn't mean you can't think about how a stock market could be better organized and less prone to have crashes, for example.
Well, you've just heard tonight a kind of masterclass in fielding questions, and that in itself, I hope, was worth your time.